When I looked at the Schedule F order and when I looked at the current rulemaking, on its face, I took it to be both lawful and I think good policy. But I think a lot of folks worry, and probably should worry, that what's really at stake is not just that thinnest veneer of policy-making employees near the top of an agency, but that this is just the first step towards a much more dramatic rollback of civil service protections for hundreds of thousands of government employees, which I do think would be an enormous mistake.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. I'm excited to continue our discussion on government accountability and how to think about the way public institutions operate today. I'm joined by two people who've spent careers at the intersection of law, government, and accountability. Clark Kelso, Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives and Professor at McGeorge School of Law, and Adam White, Senior Fellow at American Enterprise Institute and Co-Director of George Mason's Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Clark, you've worked on some of California's most broken systems, from prison, healthcare, insurance regulations, state IT. And Adam, you study the rules that govern how those systems operate, or at least are intended to operate. When a system is genuinely failing the public, is it the problem that there's usually bad management? Is there bad structure, bad law and policy, or is there something else? Maybe Clark, you go first.
Well, I would say all of the above. By the time you get to the point where an agency really is broadly failing, it's usually multifaceted, and it's usually something that has developed over a fairly long period of time. And you'll have failures in leadership, in political leadership, failures at the agency. You probably will have legal problems that you will uncover. And certainly you will discover that there typically are budget issues that have been left unresolved for long periods of time. And that is, I think, what makes it so challenging at times to come in and fix broken agencies. And we have plenty of examples in California. The federal government has plenty of examples there as well, as I'm sure Adam would agree.
I would agree. That's really well put. I reject the false choice between failures of planning and failures of execution. And we often see both at the same time. Just thinking about the federal level, it's hard enough to legislate wisely on just a given topic, something durable that can last for the long run. But then to have so many things that the federal government takes responsibility for, sometimes of necessity and sometimes of choice, try to legislate wisely on the things that are actually durable for years, decades, now for some things a century or more. That's hard enough. And then so much hinges on the quality of administration, on the quality of the president on down. And so things can go wrong in any number of ways. And I think in our era, we see all of the above.
So we're talking a lot about failure, whether it's failure in political leadership, whether it's failure in planning or failure in execution. But we have a system designed to mitigate and to help prevent a lot of that from happening. We've got three branches of government and a public that expects them to deliver on their responsibilities. So how can there be so much failure?
Look, at the federal level, we have a government that's built well to prevent mistakes from being made, right? We have a system of checks and balances that makes it hard to get things done. I'm very sympathetic to that system. But the problem is, once mistakes are made, the system makes it very hard to unmake the mistakes. And so we have a lot of that too. But furthermore, and this is my broader point, for decades now, we've seen so much frustration with the pace of government, the inability of Congress to do anything, the unwillingness of Congress to do anything, that, in my opinion, we now, for years, have lived in a system where the executive branch and administration really is front and center in policy making, sometimes by choice and sometimes of necessity. And the executive branch, it actually is, relatively speaking, built for speed. I know a lot of our audience might not believe that. I know sometimes it does take a long time to get something done in administration. I'm not being too glib about that. But relatively speaking, compared to Congress, administration is a Porsche or an F1 race car. And so through administration, a lot of things can get done much more quickly, and the rest of government, whether it's Congress or the courts, really struggle to keep up. And I think right now, it's the pace of change and the pace of policymaking in our government that causes the most problems, forces the most mistakes, and leaves us all with a feeling of whiplash, not just from one administration to the next, but from 1 year to the next or 1 month to the next.
Clark, how do you see the different branches of government, separations of power, and different responsibilities?
Well, Adam and I probably agree. I'll state it a little differently. The federal government was, in some sense, designed to move slowly, not to do things, so that you have a bicameral legislature. You can't even get through the first branch easily at times. But I do think that once Congress has acted, then the Constitution does prescribe the right approach. You've got an executive who has the duty to see that the laws are faithfully executed. And I again agree with Adam that in that context, actually administrations and administrative agencies can act quickly. I do think what we have seen, and again, Adam and I may agree, over the past 35 years or so, where the political parties have become so polarized and really unable to work together, and Congress has been so closely split that Congress becomes, for a lot of things, dysfunctional. Now, as we know, even Congress can act very quickly when it has the political will. But on a lot of issues, they just aren't able to get the job done. And I do think one of the challenges that we face is that the executives, presidents, increasingly, seem to view the failure of Congress to act as meaning the executive branch must act. And that does create separation of powers problems because the primary lawmaker is supposed to be Congress. And I think a lot of the things that we've seen in recent years, a lot of the challenges, the presidential action, unilateral presidential actions, are a result of that problem. Presidents trying to fix something where really it's Congress that needs to act. And then the courts have to end up stepping in, saying, no, that's not the way our system is structured.
Clark, on that point, I hearken back to all the presidents who like to say, if Congress won't act, I will. And there's some truth in that. But I think, much to the point you just made, that actually it's almost the opposite sometimes. It's because a president will act, Congress won't. I have to be honest, Clark, for me, I started thinking along those lines a little over a decade ago when President Obama had his sort of famous pen and phone moment. Now, in all candor, I was a lot more sympathetic to the George W. Bush presidency than the Barack Obama presidency. And so, of course, I would say, well, a lot of this problem started around about 10 or 15 years ago. But that's surely not fair. There's other examples, I suppose, from well before that, right? Whether it was things that President Bush did on domestic policy or foreign policy, things that President Clinton did famously on tobacco policy with the FDA leading the way in a new way. Am I being reasonably even-handed about that? Or maybe I'm missing the obvious examples that come from my own side of the political street?
Well, no, I think you're being even-handed about it. And this is an equal opportunity problem for presidents. And in part, it is because there's sort of an expectation, I think, nationally. When I elect the president, I'm expecting things to happen. And what we have to remember is the president, just like all of the administrative agencies, they're actually sort of bound by a lot of law that is already in place. In many cases has been in place for 40, 50, or 60 years. And it simply isn't the case that the president can come in and do whatever he or she wants. And that's a good thing. And it's a good thing that administrative agencies need to follow their statutorily authorized functions and stay on track. That is, I think, what respect for the rule of law, why that's so important for public administration, because that's what keeps the people in administrative agencies from essentially feeling like we get to do whatever we want. It isn't that simple.
Let me ask a two-part question here. We're talking about the duty to act, failure to act, whether people have the ability to do something or they're just unwilling to do something. There's this theory out there around the unitary executive. What do you think about that? And what is the impact on the larger administrative state?
I tend to be skeptical of the constitutional force of the unitary executive theory. It's an interesting theory, but we've moved beyond that a long time ago, back at least the 1930s, with the Humphreys executor case, where the Supreme Court had started to indicate, well, you can have independent agencies. And since then, there has been 25, 30 or so agencies, probably more, where Congress has made this compromise. We'll give the agency a little more power, but we don't want it to be too subject to influence and control by whoever happens to be the president. And it does seem to me this has worked rather well as a compromise. The Supreme Court recently, in the last decade, is skeptical of the independent agencies, although I think we all will end up discovering that somehow the Federal Reserve will be an exception, that they will leave the Federal Reserve as an independent agency. And of course, if you're going to have one agency as an independent agency, I kind of wonder, well, then why are all the rest of them of doubtful validity? Yeah. So I think firmly in the camp that the president in general has extraordinary powers, the head of the executive branch, but there are some circumstances where it's good to have the independent agency structure.
Clark, I could talk your ear off on why the Fed might be different, but I don't want to put our listeners to sleep, especially the listeners who are listening to this while they're driving their cars. I'm very sympathetic generally to the unitary executive theory, not on the Fed, but for other things. And I agree with you that we seem to be in, a decade now of the Supreme Court expressing skepticism of some of the breadth of agency independence that had been previously recognized by the Supreme Court and other courts. We might see in the next few months a Supreme Court decision really fundamentally changing its view of independent agencies and presidential authority over the heads of agencies. I'm very sympathetic to that change, to say the least. We've seen for 15 years now the Supreme Court steadily expanding presidential power over the heads of agencies in terms of who can stay in office, who can be, or the other way, who can be fired by a president. What's been interesting to me has been over that same 15-year period, we've seen the court narrowing the field of discretion for presidents when it comes to substantive policies on whether the president can fire people at the heads of the agencies. The court keeps expanding discretion. But when it comes to substantive policies, the court keeps contracting discretion. We saw that throughout the last 15 years in the Obama administration, the Trump administration, during the Biden administration on issues like the student loan waivers, the Clean Power Plan out of the EPA. And now in the Trump administration, we're seeing it too, right? The same court that seems poised to expand President Trump's power to fire the heads of, say, the Federal Trade Commission, just dealt him a loss on the big tariff case, the substantive policy. I think they're going to deal him a loss on birthright citizenship. And it's been very interesting to watch the court operate, it seems to me, on two tracks. On what I call the who questions, they expand the president's power. But on the what questions, substantive policy questions, they seem to be putting more and more guardrails on presidents.
I think that's right, particularly the guardrails that reflect through what the court has called its major questions doctrine, that agencies don't quite have, and presidents then, don't quite have as much leeway and as much freedom at the edges of administrative agency powers. Yeah. And the court itself has reasserted its authority to say what the law is in interpreting statutes that authorize administrative agencies. So they recently have overruled something called the Chevron deference doctrine in order to give the courts a greater role in determining largely where those guardrails are. Yeah. On the unitary executive, one thing that I think the court might want to think about doing Take a look at what states have done in structuring their governments. Most states, I wonder, I haven't done a study of it, but a lot of states, they don't have a unitary executive. California, we've got, separately elected constitutional officers who are, our attorney general is separately elected from our governor. That guarantees independence. So it may be that the judgment of history in the United States is that it actually is better to have a more separated, divided executive branch itself. So I do think the Supreme Court, in thinking about unitary executive power, maybe should take a look and learn from what state and local governments have done.
So we're talking about theories around the structure of government and the responsibilities. I want to take it down a level and talk about the impact of some of that on the administrative state or on the services that government provide. So can you talk a little bit more about how government and the way in which it functions and whether these branches or leaders are doing the right things in those roles? What's the impact on services to different communities? What's the impact on views towards government? And what's the impact on the view of trust in government more broadly?
Well, that last question is especially the big one, right? But I'll start with, you said the sort of what's actually happening in reality for real lives. And obviously we're discussing this at a challenging time, right? We're just now a year into an administration that kicked off everything by kicking out a lot of people, by radically downsizing personnel in many cases, in cutting spending, reallocating spending in a variety of ways. And I'll tell you, as a small government conservative myself, I've long, wanted to see, a shrinking in the size of government in terms of its footprint in day-to-day lives. But there's a right and a wrong way to go about things. And I do think in many cases, the sheer uncertainty that was created in government and around government, it's not a good thing. I'm not for weaponizing uncertainty when it comes to what the government does to the private sector or what the government does to itself. And I do think that stability is a small c conservative value, even when reform is also a small c conservative value. So I tried throughout last year not to put too much weight on what was happening in a given moment in terms of trying to understand how the system as a whole is operating. As we said earlier, the executive branch is just built to move faster than the rest of government. And so what we saw throughout last year, throughout this sort of earthquake in government, with all the uncertainty it created for people in government and for stakeholders outside of government, it was obviously an enormously disruptive time, and I'm not trying to downplay that. But what we have seen in the last few months especially is the rest of the system, especially in terms of the courts, catching up. The courts are never going to be able to keep up with the executive branch. They're just not built for speed in the same way. And I think a lot of people's frustrations with especially the Supreme Court in the first year, I thought those criticisms were overstated. The Supreme Court was never going to be able to keep up with the Trump administration or any administration step for step. But I always said years 2, 3, and 4 will not look the same as year 1. They might still leave a lot of people disappointed, but they're going to be different. And so I think this is going to be a very interesting year to see how things play out in the courts, starting with the Supreme Court, and what lessons we can draw systematically from it.
One thing that you could credit the current administration is coming in at a fast pace and seeking to make real change. But that's not new. Previous administrations, almost every administration, tries to, quote unquote, reinvent government, or at least make some different changes around the edges. Now, there's a responsible and respectful way to go about that. And I think there's something to be said about that. And the current president, I've said this, is going to be one of the most consequential presidents of our time, and has the opportunity to be one of the most transformational ones, depending on how that's approached. Let's talk about reforming this large federal bureaucracy. What does it take to do it? Is it possible any other way? You saw earlier this year the Department of Government Efficiency. You've seen some of the impact of certain policies that are being passed and different presidential tools that are currently being used. Are those necessary to actually get to reform? Is there another way? What are your thoughts on this, Clark?
Well, government reform is an age-old topic and effort. Every president, it seems, tries to do something of it, so it's not a new type of initiative. And many states have done the same thing. Let's try to reform our government fundamentally. Governor Schwarzenegger out here in California had a performance review in the first decade here, and we produced thousands of pages of recommendations. The problem with that approach usually is, in order actually to downsize, you've got to be able to get Congress to go along with you, typically, because the size of the agencies and their responsibilities, that really is defined by Congress in passing substantive statutes saying, here are the jobs we want you to do, and in then establishing a budget for the agencies. And you discovered, President Trump is discovering this year, although Elon Musk's DOGE effort, it went around, they reduced lots of things, a lot of people got fired. Well, what you discovered was, first, he overdid it a little bit, so they've had to hire back in some agencies. And then when it turns out you get over to Congress in many cases is not going along with those sort of reductions. So that type of downsizing of government, it is a very challenging thing to do. Now, there's one other thing that President Trump is in the process of trying to do that I think is a greater threat, frankly, to public administration. And this is a detail type in the weeds thing. But he's trying to change the top tier of the civil service so that right now, a president may have 5,000 political appointees. President Trump is in the process of changing that, so he'll have 55,000 political appointees. And the concern I think that many of us have by that is you then move away from a professional civil service who knows how to work government to a much more politically oriented civil service. And then depending upon, how loyal those appointees are to a particular president, I think that presents a rule of law type challenge. They're right at the point of trying to issue regulations that would govern what I've just described. Like many things, I'm sure there'll be legal challenges. Just to go back to something Adam said, I agree completely with Adam's thinking about the first year of President Trump's term. It was no surprise the courts, and including the Supreme Court, were laying back. Most of President Trump's victories in the first year were as part of emergency orders, where the court appropriately gave a lot of deference to the executive branch. We're now seeing, as Adam says, the courts start to catch up, where you're getting to final decisions. The tariffs being a good first example, birthright citizenship is another. There are a number of lower court opinions dealing with policies in health and human services, vaccine policy, where we may see the administration not be as successful. Because at the end of the day, the court may look at it and say, well, you pushed too far beyond the boundaries of your authority. So we have to be patient and see how the system of separation of powers works. Courts are almost always going to be 2 to 3 years behind. It's just the nature of judicial process.
Adam, Clark talked a little bit about the different appointee structures and mentioned some potential changes around the number of political appointees. Our larger federal system is over 2 million civilians at least. And so a smaller fraction of that becoming political versus career. And then looking at some of the other checks, could you get through appointing all of those individuals? Some are Senate confirmed, so you have another opportunity to weigh in there. What are your thoughts on that divide from political career leadership and the impact that it would have on how we govern?
I'm really wary of radical change right now on these issues. I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of countervailing considerations. I testified before a Senate committee just a few years ago, a Democratic-led Senate committee, about the problem of too many jobs requiring Senate advice and consent, and why can't we just have the president in charge of more appointments so we can do things more quickly? In hindsight, that's a little ironic. But I also know, going much further back in history, that from the very start, from the very founding, the folks who built our government in the first instance, they were very wary of radical change from one administration to the next. They didn't want a spoils system. There's always been spoils, but not a whole system made out of it. And so, and the last historical point is that after the Civil War, right, in the decades following it, the institution of the first version of modern civil service laws, the Pendleton Act, was sort of a great bipartisan achievement. And so I'm very wary of the notion that even the unitary executive theory, which I, again, totally believe in its place, opens the door to just unlimited presidential political partisan micromanagement of the bureaucracy. That's a recipe for disaster, and history shows us that time and time again. But, and here's what I'll put in the but, because there's not been enough disagreement here, so maybe this will cause disagreement. When I do look at Schedule F, the original Schedule F order that President Trump kind of dashed off at the end of his first term, which I take to be largely the focus of this initial rulemaking, I looked at that and I thought, well, I don't know whether it's good policy or not. I think it might be at a very limited level. I'm making a small little layer, like sort of with my hands, I'm saying at the very top level of civil service, I don't necessarily, I was less worried about it, I'll put it that way. And frankly, when I went by my reading of the civil service laws, if an office, if a employee at a senior level has genuine policy-making authority and discretion, as I understood it, even under the civil service statute, that could be carved out from the full civil service protections. So when I looked at the Schedule F order and when I looked at the current rulemaking, on its face, I took it to be both lawful and I think good policy. But I think a lot of folks worry, and probably should worry, that what's really at stake is not just that thinnest veneer of policy-making employees at the top, near the top of an agency, but that this is just the first step towards a much more dramatic rollback of civil service protections for hundreds of thousands of government employees, which I do think would be an enormous mistake.
Clark, do you agree with that statement? I mean, how else do you make change in leadership, change in government programs, and essentially remake government without really going in and doing some radical reform?
I do think on this one, Adam and I just disagree a little bit. I think it's bad policy and will end up resulting in bad law. You need to have political appointees at the very top level. But in my experience, certainly in state government, and I think it's true in federal government as well, those top civil servants, one of the reasons they are where they are is they are able to turn on a dime when a new executive comes in and says, we're going to go in a slightly different direction. The second thing, though, that you get that's so important with those top civil servants is you get all of the history of the agency, all of the political battles that have been fought below the waterline, all of the rules that govern, all of the limitations that the agency has, as well as its powers. And those are the people who actually are able to educate the newcomer political appointees about this is how the agency works, this is how things get done. If you sweep away all of that knowledge, it's going to be first chaos because the newbies won't know really how to function in a government agency. And then I think what ends up happening is there's less respect for the law establishing that agency. And you end up with less respect for the rule of law because suddenly everybody comes in new and says, we're going to do everything differently. No, you actually don't have the authority just to do everything differently. And that's part of, I think, the challenge.
I want to make sure that I get to more optimistic view here. We're talking a lot about failure, a lot about limitations and challenges, And I want to end by building a case for optimism. So, Clark, my last question to you, how do we rebuild trust in government and in government institutions? And how do we improve government? What's the one thing that has to happen first for us to get there?
Well, that's a really tough question. I think your reference to public trust is a place to start. And you can't do it government-wide. You have to pick some targets that you think you can accomplish, some real improvements, and see if you can get the political will to make that happen. One area, for example, might be in the FAA, because of the recent problems that we've had with their technology is so outdated that you're now having near accidents and real accidents, largely because, well, we've got outdated technology. We haven't properly funded the people who work up in the tower, the air traffic controllers. I'm sure there are quite a few other safety issues, many of which the National Transportation Safety Board already has reports about. Can't we perhaps start with that? Let's see if we can improve one federal agency in a way that would generate among the public a real appreciation that, okay, Republicans and Democrats can come together on something that really shouldn't be political. Public safety in air traffic and control, well, that should be something everybody can get behind. And I do think if you focus on something like that, success can lead to more success. And what we need here is something that is going to be a clear public success. So that would be my recommendation.
I agree completely with Clark. So we're back in agreement here. I think one of the mistakes in modern government is that it's almost all rhetorical, right? You see president after president trying to argue the public into concluding that things seem better than the people feel they are, right? This is bipartisan, president after president saying, well, here's the studies that show why this is going to be fine. Here's the argument for why it's going to be fine. In the end, what builds trust is successful improvement of people's lives, right? And when government can do that the right way, that more than anything will build trust. And so I think one of the first steps towards that is people in government saying, I can improve lives in the real world and not just rhetorically. It's subject to all the usual legal constraints and all that, right? Agencies staying within their mission and so on. Government is more than just a rhetorical exercise. Now, one of the reasons why I'm hopeful is because I live in Washington, D.C., or I work in Washington, D.C., and every year, every day, every month, I meet young people of both parties who come here because they want to make a difference. I'm recording this at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm lucky to meet young people here who came to Washington, like I did, from the Midwest, because they really believe in the government. I came to Washington in the late 90s. My first job was an internship in the Clinton White House in the West Wing on the first day of the impeachment trial. I wouldn't have thought back in those days that would be the good old days. Sweet to some people, their start is going to be now, and they're going to look fondly back on changes and good things they were able to do right now in the midst of everything we're decrying. And I meet young folks like that at George Mason University, where I teach, and other places where I visit. And then last, I'll just say, I'm lucky to spend time over on Capitol Hill chatting with staff and members of Congress, again, of both parties, although admittedly more on the we'll say the conservative side, but not exclusively. And across party lines, I meet lots of young people who came to the Hill to make a difference, young members of Congress who got elected to make a difference. And they understand that it's not always supposed to be this way, where you just go to Congress and then just argue with each other. And so as long as there's hopeful people in institutions and in Congress, I'll have hope too.
I've said before that everyone has a role to play in government. That's all three of our branches, as well as the American people. Today, we've had an equal opportunity discussion on the role and responsibility of the different branches. And I believe we've concluded that leadership is needed to reform government and to ensure government continues to provide the best services to the American public. I want to thank Adam and Clark for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Thanks, James-Christian.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.